So we are about halfway through grouting our shower right now, and I want to share my experience using the Mapei Ultracolor Plus FA grout. So I've used a couple different grouts in the past. I've used the pre-mixed grout you can see in our other backsplash video, and we've used a couple just basic cementitious grouts. But since this is a shower, it's going to be a wet area, we're going to be scrubbing this area, I want to make sure that we get something super durable. I didn't want to go for epoxy just because I hear it's really difficult to work with. So we did a lot of research and we hear that this FA grout is extremely good for shower applications. I saw some resources out there. There's a famous video that says don't use this if you're a beginner. But we did our research and we thought that we could handle it, and I want to kind of share some of the issues that we ran into, and hopefully this will help you when you do your project. And I think the thing I like about it most is that the FA stands for fine aggregate, and you can tell it's a very, very fine texture. Some of the other grouts I've worked with, you can kind of see the grit, and it gets you not as crisp of a line. That also makes me feel a lot better about the waterproofability of it, so I'm pretty excited to have this in our shower. So this grout, as with a lot of different cementitious mixes, once you add the water initially and mix it up, you don't want to add more water later. It can be tempting, since this is a rapid set, that after 45 minutes to an hour it starts to get thick. You might want to add some more water to dilute it, but that water will actually break down those chemical bonds and make the final grout a lot weaker, and it might end up being really crumbly and it might not end up setting properly at all. So if it starts to thicken up on you, just work as much as you can and then you just have to start over. When mixing the grout, I recommend wearing disposable gloves as well as a mask to prevent yourself from breathing in this fine particulate and getting in your lungs. According to the instructions, if you're going to mix the entire 10-pound bag, you'll need about 1 quart of water. If you're going to be mixing it in batches, as we were, then you can do a 3-to-1 ratio with just a measuring cup, so that's 3 parts of powder per 1 part of liquid. And then I'm just mixing it in a 5-gallon bucket, and I'm stirring it very slowly with a hand tool. By just slowly mixing it by hand, I'm going to minimize the amount of air that gets mixed into it, and that will give us the maximum amount of working time. If you were to use an electric tool and mix it too aggressively, then a bunch of air is going to get mixed into your grout, and that's going to shorten the pot life, and you're only going to have a very short amount of time to work with it. It does say that it's a rapid set compound, which is probably the reason that it's not super beginner friendly. We were working at about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'll say we mixed it and it maintained that original kind of pudding consistency for about 50 minutes. And then between 50 and 60 minutes it started to thicken up a little bit to about that normal consistency I'm used to working with. But then it just very rapidly kept thickening up, and by about 80 minutes it was like completely bricked and totally unworkable. So you're going to want to be able to finish your project in about an hour. So we found in that 1 hour time frame we were able to get about 40 square feet done, which means we didn't even finish the entire bucket that I had prepared, because it just turned into this kind of crumbly mixture that was just so dry it was hard to work with. So I recommend that if you're just starting out, you start off with smaller batches, preferably do an entire wall section so you're not stopping and starting in the same wall. And then as you get the hang of it, maybe you can do more and more surface area. I'm sure professional tilers could have done this entire bathroom, which is about 80 to 90 square feet. But as you're starting off, we're definitely going to do it in sections. With all colored grouts, you want to be careful when you batch it out, because if you do one part of a wall and then you remix another batch, if just slight differences in your water consistency, or if the pigment had been separated slightly differently, you might get 2 different grout colors. So in order to minimize the noticeability of that, you might want to make your batches so you can do an entire wall, and then of course pre-mix that powder as well as you can and keep your mixing consistent. We had read that you can get a wet sponge and sort of pre-wet all of your joints and tiles right before you apply the grout, and I highly recommend you do that. We found out once we started doing that, we had a little bit more workability for getting the grout to move around, and then still had enough stiffness that we could wipe out the joints pretty well. One element that I was pleased about working with this grout is that even though it stiffened up almost immediately after going into the joints, we could start wiping it down immediately, but we could still kind of work those joints even like 20-30 minutes later, and they were still at a good stiffness that they weren't getting wiped out, but they were also pliable enough that we could still clean them and still get those crisp corners. Applying this grout to the floor is going to be a little bit different than applying it to the walls. So when I was discussing the walls, I mentioned that it's very important to pre-wet those gaps between the tiles so that when you apply grout there, it doesn't just suck all the moisture out. I'll say that that's not nearly as critical when you apply the grout to the floor.
With the floor, you have A, the flexibility of working on a horizontal surface, so you don't have to worry about the grout sliding down on you. And B, I noticed that when I overdid it, I ended up with kind of this big soupy mess and the moisture had nowhere to go. So I would say when doing the pre-wetting those joints, you don't have to apply it nearly as heavily when you're working on the floor. There's two ways that gravity is actually working against you as you apply grout to the floor. So the first is that as the gravity is sort of pulling on your grout, it's going to make those joints sink down a little bit, and that could be more than you want. Another way is that as the grout sinks down, some of the air bubbles will start to push up and you'll end up with little pinholes in your grout. To avoid both of these, what you can do is, first of all, as you're applying the grout, try to press it into those joints as deeply as possible so that way you fill up the joint instead of just having a thin superficial layer on top. And that'll minimize the movement. The second thing you can do is after you apply the grout and you start working on the next section, go back to that first section just a couple minutes later and you can sort of apply another superficial coat to cover up any of the defects.
Overall, I do actually recommend this grout even for beginners. I think it works very well in this scenario. If you guys have your own preferences, please put that down in the comment section below. We'd love to hear about it. I would say the two watchouts are, number one, make sure you have a good consistency before you start. And number two, work in manageable batches because this is rapid setting, so you want to make sure you got it completely ready by the time you're done. If you found this video, we'd appreciate a like and subscribe. Thanks guys.